Hey folks, this is a quick 3 or 4 or 5 PowerPoint slide lecture to introduce the class. The first kind of issue we're covering, obviously, the first word in the class is law. And the question is, what is law? Where does it come from? How do you describe it? Well, back in the olden times, back in the olden days, there was the idea of natural law, that laws came from the natural world, separate from the people in it. And there's a certain appeal to that when you think about the laws of gravity, the laws of the physical world certainly exist, but this was a different kind of thing. It drew from religion, it drew from kind of spiritualism. The Metaphysical Club during the Civil War, Oliver Wendell Holmes had this idea of kind of a law that was greater than the individuals it governed. In fact, you can still find echoes of this idea in the concept that's frequently referred to in civil law, which is that people have an obligation to act reasonably. If you are driving a car and there's an accident, if you were behaving reasonably, if you were behaving as a reasonable person would, then you are likely to be found not liable. But if you are behaving unreasonably, if you diverge from a reasonableness standard, you can be found liable. But over time, the idea of where law comes from has evolved into a concept called positivism, and that's not positive in the good sense. It's positive in the sense that the law is posited, the law is created, the law is proposed by the population, by the men and women it's going to govern. In this scenario, the law is what people say it is, what people vote and say it is. Now, there are times when people may vote to say that there's a law that prohibits X, and the courts might decide, well, I'm sorry, that law violates a constitutional right. But it's not a divine right, it's not a natural right, it's a right that exists in the Constitution. A definition of what law is a body of rules of conduct, of binding legal force, prescribed, recognized, and enforced by controlling authority. It's kind of important to think about the idea that for a law to be a law, you've got to have somebody to enforce it. A law that isn't enforced is not much of a law. A simpler definition might be authoritative rules created by a government. In the United States, the Constitution is called the law of the land. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Anything that contradicts the Constitution must fail. The Supreme Court pronounces meanings of things in the Constitution. The Supreme Court isn't making its own laws. The Supreme Court is interpreting the Constitution to say what the law is. There's a gray area because sometimes it feels like they're making up the law, but in fact, what the Supreme Court is supposed to be doing is pronouncing on what the law is, what the existing law is and means. Under the Constitution, you have federal statutes, you have state constitutions, state statutes, local ordinances. You have something called the common law, which is, when we talked a second ago about the reasonable person standard, that's part of the common law. That's not codified in some kind of statute. What trumps, a federal statute or a state law? If they're in the same area, the federal statute trumps. The federal statute takes precedence over a state statute in the same area. There are also things like administrative law, international law. Well, international law is one of these weird things where, international law, you have to have a body to enforce the law, and the law has to have some sort of legitimacy. So if people are not agreeing to be bound by the law, by international law, then it can be hard to enforce. You can say that there are international laws of human rights and international laws of trade, and there are all kinds of laws, but by and large, those laws are codified and agreed to by the parties that they're going to govern. International law by itself is a very slippery area to get into. Treaties are binding on the countries that agree to them, but again, you've got to enforce the treaty. If you can't enforce it, it's not much of a law. The Constitution is the law of the land. It's a blueprint for the structure of the whole country. You guys are reading it. I hope you read it. Folks are always surprised it's not very long. It has 7 articles, has 27 amendments. And in those amendments are things that you've heard the terms of. You've heard phrases about the Commerce Clause, the power of the purse. You've heard phrases about the right to vote. You've heard phrases about cruel and unusual punishment, all kinds of things. The right to remain silent, the right to have counsel. That's all in the Constitution. And as you go through it, I hope that you can identify which ones have particular resonance with you. A constitution is a system of beliefs and laws by which a country, a state, or an organization is governed, a document that describes the system. And another definition of a constitution is the physical health and condition of a person or an animal. You have a strong constitution, meaning that you have a strong overall physical health. Well, the Constitution of the United States is a document that describes and prescribes the physical health of the nation. That's basically where we're starting from. Everything that we study this semester comes from the structure that gives it legitimacy and defines it. So in our case, law, the courts, and politics, that all comes from the Constitution, which is why it's the first thing we're reading. Okay, thanks.